Hello and welcome to a new series of conversations where the Center for a Smart Future speaks to researchers and practitioners from around the world who are working on frontier themes relating to nature, climate, and economy. So we'll be discussing their work, emerging global trends, and also considerations that countries like Sri Lanka should keep an eye out for. So today we have with us Katie Hutchinson, who's a PhD researcher affiliated to the Department of Biology at the University of Oxford. She's particularly researching, among many other things, the impact of nature-based solutions on ecosystem health in the tropical Andean region of South America, and currently she's based in Ecuador. Thank you so much, Katie, for making time, and lovely to have you with us today.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor. I'm
No
excited to
problem at
chat.
all. Yeah, likewise. So I think the first thing I actually want to ask you is you recently came from COP16 to the Convention on Biological Diversity. So I was thinking of starting out the conversation there, but just to give a bit of background context as well to viewers who might be new to the space. So recently, the Convention on Biological Diversity had its 16th Conference of Parties in Colombia. And this is particularly related to the Global Biodiversity Framework that was agreed upon back in 2022, where I'm sure some of you would have heard about the 30 by 30 targets, where there is a target of conserving 30% of the world's land and sea by 2030. And also, I think it's in this context, it's very important because there are several COPs actually happening, because in addition to the Conference of Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, which just finished and Katie attended, we also have the COP on the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, COP29, happening in Azerbaijan in November. And also we have the COP on the Convention on to combat desertification in Saudi Arabia in December. So there are a lot of very important environmental conversations that are happening. So Katie, just to start off, what were your first impressions taking part in COP, particularly as a first-time participant, and what was your experience in Colombia?
I was going to say it was my first COP ever, CBD, Triple C, or CCD. It was great. It was really, really interesting, and I learned a lot, both good and bad, about the way that these conferences are run. My primary takeaway is that it is absolutely huge. It was unfathomable how many pavilions and events and different things were going on. Um, for some background context, you have two zones. So you have the blue zone, which is badge only. So from NGOs, delegations, academia and research, indigenous groups, and a whole bunch of other people. And then the green zone is open entirely to the public. So that kind of triples it in size. The side events run parallel to the negotiations. Some negotiations are closed to press, some working groups are open to different groups. So yeah, it was a great 2 weeks, very, very tiring though. And I admire anyone who goes to all three this year because there is no way I could do that.
Yeah, I can imagine. And so particularly talking about COP16, I think so just to give a bit of context on Sri Lanka, right? So Sri Lanka,
Mhm.
from a ecological biodiversity point of view, um, there is rich species endemism, there's rich biodiversity. In fact, unfortunately, it has been recognized as a biodiversity hotspot, along with Western Ghats, which means that even though we have high plant endemism, we also have lost at least 70% of species. And on the flip side, we have just come out of economic crisis, and right now the government's in a very tight fiscal space. And it's not just Sri Lanka, I think around the developing country space, we see many countries, particularly post-COVID, having to navigate this tightrope of having increasing ecological conservation demands while trying to balance an increasingly tight economic space. And even in COP16, I think one of the biggest themes, and particularly one of the biggest, I would say, expectations after COP22 was figuring out whether there would be a fund, a central fund. And what we did see was that central fund didn't come into being. So what were your thoughts on that? What were like the inside conversations? What were the trends that you saw? And what do you think we can look out for as we go into maybe the other two COPs these 2 months and also the next round of COP conversations?
Yeah, I think there in what you just said, there's kind of two questions because the whole way through COP, there was this kind of quietly hushed $700 billion question of this is how much they say it's going to cost to repair nature and get it to a level where we can basically continue on a healthy planet. And then the involvement of developing countries, like you said. And they were two of the main things that I saw and that kind of came out of this COP. Especially in the latter half or the last day of negotiations. It was the longest running negotiations that CBD COP have ever had. And so many developing countries' delegations had to fly home. So they were actually missing from the negotiations and quorum was not met. So the COP was terminated, which we're constantly saying that we need to give those in the global south and developing countries and those that are mega diverse the kind of space and the floor to have their opinions, but we're not actually enabling them to do so because all of those in the global north could rebook their flights. It didn't matter if they had stayed an extra day, they could afford the hotels. And those from countries, I don't know specifically Sri Lanka or the delegations, kind of the Asian delegations, but a lot of those from South America they had to leave. So yeah, I think we have a long way to go with kind of involving those that are developing, but you also have a great position where coming out of a kind of crisis, I think if focus is put on nature, the influence that it can have on the climate and the economy is currently undermined. But if we can kind of shift that mindset and reframe it as though, Sri Lanka is having visited, it's beautiful, and you have so much opportunity with the biodiversity that you have. That I think if it can be slightly reframed and put at the fundamentals of a kind of recovering economy, that would be really beneficial. We can obviously delve into like blue finance, green finance, credits and stuff a bit later on. I'm a bit skeptical if they're not implemented correctly, but they're a great option for developing kind of economies and things, especially for those in the global south. And they were kind of discussed at COP as well. So I hope that answered your question, even if slightly diverting.
No, you did, and honestly, I have like a couple of follow-ups on that. I'll start with, I think, I would say I'm the most clueless about this question, which is that when I read about the issue of not having the caucus, right, where a lot of developing countries they had to leave because the conversation's going. I think if I'm not wrong, the Colombian president submitted a paper at 3 a.m., if I'm not mistaken, some really, really late time, right? How does the
So,
structure, yeah, sorry.
oh, sorry. I was going to say the Oxford delegation, the negotiation started, I think, at 7 p.m. and they left at 9 a.m. So they were in the room for 14 hours and they were only given a half an hour negotiation break. And my colleagues were asleep on the floor. And then they woke up and carried on reporting. So like there was no let up and there was no kind of, to my knowledge, acknowledgement that people were having to leave until the president called quorum and that basically there wasn't enough voices in the room for there to be a unanimous vote. So it had to be ceased and pushed back to a subsidiary next year, which I think is in Bangkok, if I'm correct. Yeah. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing. So I just want to know like how does the agenda work? Because I was trying to follow it up, but I couldn't do enough research on this. Why was this conversation, which was I would say one of the two most important conversations at the COP, at the end, is that like a natural part of the agenda? Is it something that I would say we need to rethink from purely an organizational point of view, or are there some practicalities involved which makes this to be so like, was there no other space for this conversation to be maybe towards the front end of things? How does the mechanics work?
So obviously this was my first COP, but I think all of the CBD COPs have followed the same kind of protocol. And I think there was a massive oversight from the kind of organizers this year that negotiations weren't going to overrun. It's the first one since we implemented the KMGBF. So there's so many things to talk about. Basically, at the start of the COP, talking points and conversations such as DSI, so digital sequencing, or financing, or the interface of climate change and biodiversity are split up into sections. And then they will allocate working groups. So they will kind of get split up into group projects. and 2 countries will be allocated as chairs. This is completely random. So yeah, they just pick random countries to kind of vocalize for everyone, and they will go off and negotiate separately. Some of the groups were very efficient. I know that something to do with plant use or plant conservation was completed within the first week. They basically go away, read the text, and clear all of the brackets. So countries will vote to reword things or completely take out phrases, make wording stronger or weaker. And then this gets put back to the chair and they all kind of negotiate. And the two that kind of went to the end, so financing and the whole like 8J, indigenous knowledge, that was pushed right to the end because nobody could agree. So negotiations just kept going and going and going. And each time a negotiation kind of working group stopped, the next day they would have to announce what time it started again, in what room, and press aren't allowed. So you can't take photos, you can't film, it's completely a closed room. And then, yeah, then it gets put back to the entire kind of delegation, and it's a big process.
No, I mean, that makes sense. And yeah, one thing that you said also at the previous answer is about
Mhm.
private financing and particularly these innovative financing mechanisms. So one thing I
Mhm.
read was that there was a big focus on innovative financing mechanisms and a particular focus on private sector led financing. And I think one of the
Mhm.
rebuttals or one of the concerns that a lot of developing country researchers and voices were raising is that yes, while we can explore private sector sources of funding, the fundamental or the bigger part or the main burden, which is that the governmental source of fundings should also not be ignored. And the second thing along that lines is the complexity of some of these instruments, because in Sri Lanka, at least, there were a lot of conversations, particularly after the debt crisis, on unlocking some of these pots of finance, which were,
Mhm.
earmarked towards green, blue, and similar things. But the issue is if you're not careful and if you're not intentional with how you design some of these instruments, the benefits that you would like to see at the end might not really come through the funding. So how was this conversation on innovative financing mechanisms like the biodiversity credits and the blue bonds, the carbon credits really work in this particular space? Not the carbon credits, like the biodiversity credits. I think that is important. Yeah.
So, as well as being in the main negotiations, there was also a whole bunch of side events kind of exploring credits. Obviously, they're relatively new in the field, especially biodiversity credits. Carbon credits have been around a while, and many are still very skeptical around greenwashing. When you're saying about government financing as well and private financing, there's obviously a lot of private companies will or can greenwash with their carbon credits and their kind of financing towards biodiversity. And one of the problems with private financing and the benefits of government funding, if it can be found, is that it's often longer term. So the problem with a lot of these financing mechanisms is that there'll be short bursts of financing for kind of a large amount, but for a short time. And the problem with nature recovery and nature protection is that it doesn't happen overnight. You can't just offer X amount of dollars to a project and then cease paying, because it takes time to protect and manage. And after a set time, nature can recover on its own, but it has to have continued monitoring at the start. So that's the benefit of government funding, and also that governments have to be transparent, especially in a UN CBD kind of setting. It's much easier for private financing to go under the net or not be as crystal clear and transparent. Um, and then, sorry, what was your second question? I've completely forgotten.
No, it was just that I saw a couple of debates on the emphasis on these sources of financing in the
Oh,
context
yeah.
of this larger funding or the fund that was not materialized in CBD, and
Mm.
whether that is a distraction to this larger ask by particularly the developing blocks that there needs to be this big pot of fund being under the CBD framework that needs to focus on biodiversity.
Yeah, so obviously that big fund wasn't approved. There was the Cali fund, which was approved, which basically is when the global north or developed countries exploit/use, whichever word you would like to choose, global south resources, they are governmentally obliged. It's not legally enforced, and there was some contention around that, but they will be obliged to contribute finances towards the global south for them to kind of develop and protect their ecosystems. So yeah, it's a huge shame that this fund wasn't created. Half of that Cali fund is earmarked for Indigenous peoples and local communities, which is a benefit. But I think it will be a while until we see a UN CBD massive pot of money appearing, because clearly governments aren't focusing enough or paying enough attention to what is needed or being called for. It seemed to me that a lot of them were kind of acknowledging it, saying, yes, we need this money, but no one was kind of reaching into their pocket being like, well, here's my contribution. And they hadn't even come with revised NBSAPs. Even the UK didn't come with NBSAP, an updated NBSAP plan, which was the primary or one of the primary things of this COP. So, if we're not even coming with hopes, how are we going to come with money?
Yeah, honestly, because that's actually the second thing I want to talk to you about, because a big part of this particular COP was also figuring out actionable steps
Mm-hmm.
towards conservation and beyond, right? When it comes to biodiversity. And from what I read yesterday, only about 44 out of 196 parties had submitted the new NBSAP. So even Sri Lanka is right now revising the NBSAP.
Mm-hmm.
The consultations I think were going on until very recently. I read that some of the developing country concerns were the fact that funding, particularly from the global framework, wasn't coming fast enough for them to be revising, and secondly, the fact that there wasn't enough time. But what were the
Mm-hmm.
conversations like during the negotiations? Because, like you said, it's not just a developing country concern, because of course a lot of countries are complicit in this matter of not giving out NBSAPs. And I think the last moment, if I'm not mistaken, they produced national targets, if I'm not mistaken, where instead of actionable plans like what the NBSAP would have, each country would just state XYZ targets that they would like to achieve without really having the burden of pushing forward plans. So, what are your thoughts? What are the conversations on this crucial element of implementation? And how important is that in the broader conversation about financing? Because I'm assuming financing is also based on credibility. And if plans aren't made and if plans aren't updated and if there's no trust, I'm assuming the money might also not follow through.
Yeah. So for me, watching these kind of countries scramble with their MBSATs reminded me of when I used to go to school with my home, I hadn't done my homework, and you're like frantically scribbling to get something done 2 minutes before the teacher comes around. But that's kind of nothing in the grand scheme of what an NBSAP and what a country's kind of climate change plan and biodiversity protection plan is. So I think one of the main problems, like you said, was that there wasn't enough financing, and also that now obviously NBSAPs have to be underpinned by a human rights-based approach, correctly and rightly so. Um, but I think a lot of countries kind of don't really know how to go about updating their NBSAPs. They're not sure what the next step should be for them. And I think this is where a lot of international collaboration and learning from each other can come in. Obviously, Sri Lanka isn't the only small island in the world. You guys can learn from, I don't know, Fiji or somewhere else, and then we can learn from another developed country in Europe, for example. Um, I think one of the problems is the language that's used. So the UN have all different types of language that they use in their negotiations and in their documents, and it's been updated now to say that countries are urged to update NBSATs. This doesn't mean they have to do it. It just means like I think the word urge in the UN world of dictionaries is stronger than advised, but it's not for enforceable. So how can you expect a country who has, economic collapse or for example, Vanuatu, which is literally being flooded because of climate change, they're not sitting around a desk trying to update their NBSAPs because they're not forced to, they don't have to. So how can you allocate finance to something without a plan? It's this kind of catch-22 of, okay, well, we want to do this, but we don't know how much money we have. So can we do that? Well, we don't know how much money we have. So it's like this, without this pot of money, how are we ever going to expect countries to fully contribute their NBSAPs and make them up to date and do them regularly if they don't know how to, or they don't have the resources to do so?
Yeah, I mean that's the thing. When I was reading about these urges, I mean I saw a couple of conversations about it. And like you
Mm.
rightly pointed out, apparently urges is stronger than invites or encourages, but is not as strong as requests or instructs. Like, I mean, I come from legal background, right? So I know sometimes the maybe the subjective importance of some of these nuances, but particularly when you contextualize some of these issues to what's happening around the world and how crucial it is for livelihoods and even lives. I was also wondering, like, is this where we need to be discussing? Where do we need to go? I saw one conversation particularly about the fact that maybe we should have put a deadline, and there were proposals to put a
Mm.
deadline saying all the NBSAP should be published, sorry, should be issued no later than October 2025 and things like that. I mean, yeah, so I mean, I'm also kind of like very, very curious about how we navigate this space. So, as someone who's from the outside, what can you tell me regarding the conversations that are to come? Like, is it going to be any better? Do you think there's hope in these kind of conversations leading to a sort of change that might be at least timely in the latest possible sense?
So yeah, when you were saying about October 2025, that was actually suggested by the UK. The UK delegation asked for that. Um, but although that might be short in the grand scheme of worldwide policy, I mean, all you have to do, I live in Ecuador currently, and we have such severe drought in the rainy season that I'm without electricity. You can turn on the TV and you see Valencia being flooded like never before. Like, a year in the grand scheme of climate change is a huge amount of time, and so many lives will be lost and people will be displaced. So, yeah, October 25, in my opinion, is far too far in the future. But I do think there is hope. Article 8J was passed, which in normal terms basically gives acknowledgement to Indigenous peoples and traditional knowledge, and kind of placing focus on how they have stewarded ecosystems for millennia. I can't believe it's taken 16 COPs to get there, and they're finally being recognised. But it's a big hurdle. And I think that will lead to a lot of change. There was also recognition of Afro descendants this year, which was really great. There was huge, like a little bit of a party for a couple of minutes before it went back to seriousness in the negotiation room. And I think this focus on traditional management, traditional knowledge will bring about change. From what I've seen and what I saw at COP, and just in my general kind of career and research to date, Indigenous peoples have such a kind of strong willpower to make change, and they're so eager to contribute and to work with kind of typically work with Western and global North input. So yeah, I do have a feeling of hope. I felt a little bit deflated at the end of COP when quorum ceased and things weren't met, but uh, that was an oversight from kind of the organisers, and that I'd far rather it be that way and have everybody's voice heard. I just wish they brought the intersessionals forward a bit. I think another year is too far in the future, um, because even the budget wasn't approved for CBD COP. So they can't even plan the next COP because they haven't agreed how much money they can spend. So how if you can't fund a conference, how are you going to fund climate change? Yeah.
I mean, I think that's a powerful note to kind of like summarize the entire scene. But also, I think, yeah, what you said is absolutely right. It's just about celebrating the victories and using those victories to explore stronger pathways to unlocking the more complex problems. Because even from what we see
Exactly.
from the outside, clearly people are trying inside, right? So no matter what the narratives are, there were people debating and arguing till you know 6, 9 a.m. But yeah, but I think this really segues well into what you're doing, which I personally am also very curious to know. So all I know right now is that you are in Ecuador and you
Yes.
are researching on nature-based solutions, how they
Hmm.
impact ecosystem health. And
Hmm.
if I'm right, you're also focusing on how indigenous knowledge and communities are a part of the process and how they receive it. So please tell us more, like what is your research about and how does that also link into the conversations we just had?
Sure. So, nature-based solutions as a term, simply, basically means using nature to help us mitigate, so kind of capture carbon and adapt to climate change. So, for example, mangroves. Do you have mangroves in Sri Lanka? Yeah, yeah, yeah. So
Sorry,
mangroves.
I was trying to unmute. Absolutely, yeah. So I think that's something that we couldn't really explore. But we do have a lot of mangroves, and honestly, Sri Lankan
Okay.
mangroves have been recognized as a key nature-based solution to multiple problems: coastal erosion, flooding in wetlands,
But
things like
then,
that.
yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, things like mangroves, planting trees so that crops underneath them don't get sun scalded, agroforestry for coffee and cacao. So I focus on adaptation in the tropical Andes, which spread from Venezuela to Argentina and Chile, but I focus on Ecuador. And I work in the Amazon with communities, and I look at community-led reforestation, which categorizes as a nature-based solution, and I'm a biologist by training. So the main focus of my work is using ecological monitoring, so camera traps, bioacoustics for birds, amphibians, and invertebrates and insects, and also for bats. I look at microclimate changes and soil activity in areas that have been reforested, secondary forest, and areas without intervention to monitor the differences. And then I marry this with interviews with local people and Indigenous communities to basically show that they needn't have Western input for influence in policy. So I'm using my ecological like photos and analysis to support exactly what they're saying, which is of course correct because they know this ecosystem inside out, to basically look at implementing protection and restoration in policy. So I focus on Ecuador, and then after my PhD work here kind of ceases, we'll look at expanding that further into policy across other developing global south locations. So yeah, it's great fun.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds amazing. So, a couple of questions, right? So, the first thing is, you spoke about community-led projects. So, are these projects that the community has designed, or is it the government
Mhm.
designing it, co-designing it with the communities, and they're the ones who are implementing? Like, what are these projects and how do they function? What are the mechanics behind them?
So they're kind of communities here have mingas, which are like community work days, and now have areas which they kind of have as a communal chakra or like a familial chakra, which is where they grow their produce. They have basically food sovereignty, so they grow all of their fruits and veggies that they want slash need, and wood for timber, and kind of materials for handicraft for tourism. They basically will have shared plots for the whole community to use, and these are typically managed in collaboration with an NGO. So I work with a couple of NGOs and a university here. And then they also have just their own land where they grow their own kind of crops, but these typically will be grown underneath shade trees. Especially now we're having such a severe drought. Often crops will just get sun scalded and they can't grow. So it's kind of a mechanism of agroforestry, but implemented on the whole by the whole community. So I'm measuring lots of different plots, some that are shared, some that are not, to see kind of how things work best, which species end up where, which fruit species like. So yeah, it's really cool. But yeah, Mingas are kind of the way that they are run, so community work days.
Understood. I know that your research is still ongoing, but
Mhm.
are there any maybe I would say any preliminary anecdotal evidence on how the ecosystem health has improved or any changes, like anything interesting that you found that you can share at this moment?
Yeah, so using the cameras, we've had some really cool findings. So we found that reforested areas are significantly more similar to secondary forest than areas that haven't been reforested. And these are very, very early reforestation plots. Some of them have only been in place for like 2 years, 3 years. So they're recovering quickly. Especially mammals are coming into these plots, which are kind of quite high up in the ecosystem. So it's unusual to see mammals that early on. And we've also been doing in the interviews speaking about how communities have experienced climate change, kind of whether they've experienced increased sun, increased drought, more rainfall, more storms, and kind of marrying that with some weather data that we've been looking at, and they go hand in hand as well. So it's all coming together very well. I'm still analysing my bioacoustics, but that's also looking pretty positive as well, looking at the avian kind of species around. So yeah, it's coming together and some really cool results. I'll of course share them with you when I find them completely.
Of course. I mean, so what kind of mammals were you talking about? Were they like carnivores or?
So at the moment, only in secondary forests, we've had some jaguarundi, which are big cats, ocelots, and margays. But in the rest of the world, I think they're called agoutis. But here we call them watusa, is like the indigenous name for them. They are everywhere, and we've seen couples of them in reforestation plots eating the fruit, which is really nice. And they're a great sign of ecosystem recovery. They're kind of the herbivores on the forest floor, and for those to be out in the daytime is a great sign. We've also had loads of wanta, which I can't remember the normal name for them. My head is in indigenous language, but similar to an agouti, slightly smaller. And when these come back, you start seeing the bigger cats come back. We haven't caught any jaguar yet, but I'm hopeful. Yes, so we're basically hopeful that having these around will kind of trigger keystone species to come back in after having not been in the region, because it's been exploited for kind of petroleum, oil, all sorts of things recently. So yeah, super interesting.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And like, I mean, nature-based solutions are, I mean, it's being increasingly spoken about. Like, even in the Sri
Mhm.
Lankan context, it has been there for a long time. And there are projects that are being done by both the government, but also from private actors as well. So, because I know that you have done research in general about nature-based solutions and the
Mhm.
conceptual kind of conversations as well, what are some key considerations? And also, why should or whether at all whether countries, particularly countries like Sri Lanka, who might be navigating a tighter fiscal space, like is nature-based solution something that is economically, financially viable? Is it
Mhm.
something that countries should be speaking more about? And what are some of the pathways that you think are really like, things that countries should watch out for when it comes to nature-based solutions as solution, not just to like, not for biodiversity, but also climate change and even social issues.
Mhm. So MESR or nature-based solutions are hugely growing in interest, but there is also a lot of skepticism around them, which is completely valid. I think one of the main hindrances or one of the reasons people are not sold on them is that they think that they're being marketed as an alternative for decarbonizing and kind of keeping fossil fuels underground. This is not the case at all. Obviously, that has to come first. Nature-based solutions are kind of like an addition, a top up for that. Without kind of reforestation and protection of ecosystems are NBS. So this can provide, or they can provide, I think it's nearly 40% of mitigation needs via reforestation globally to hit the biodiversity Paris Agreement. So I think if we can overcome this hurdle of kind of we're not trying to minimalize decarbonisation. And also, we need to do this whilst recognizing nature underpins the economy in so many places, especially in developing countries, in Sri Lanka as well. You have ecotourism and this crazy biodiversity which people are coming to see. So you can kind of leverage and harness the benefit of nature in kind of developing the economy. Um, I think, you know, people also underestimate how much nature is vital for general livelihoods. People can become self-subsistent, they can create handicrafts from nature, build houses, all sorts of different things. whilst being protected from natural disasters, which are becoming more common. We can't avoid that. We now have to adapt to flooding, to greater erosion, more droughts, more rainfall. So yeah, I think those in the global south need to or should place focus upon protecting what they already have first. You can't just nature-based solutions can lead to monoculture, which is awful. This is not a nature-based solution. Kind of planting 1,000,001 trees where there shouldn't be trees is not a nature-based solution. And kind of they can't be framed as, okay, I'm going to log in the Amazon, but I'm going to plant 3 mangroves in Sri Lanka. And so I'm offsetting this. This is not what NBS are about. So I think once people can get there, once NBS can be correctly framed and understood, then we can hit the ground running even faster. We're getting there, but there is still a bit of a way to go, understandably, because until now they have been used as a mechanism for greenwashing. So we've kind of got to repair what was done previously whilst running with the momentum that we already have.
I mean, absolutely. And I think that's really important because I think one thing is that the, while the scientists like yourself and the technical crowd does all the technical work, I think as everyday people, we also have a big responsibility in understanding these developments, particularly echoing the message that you said. Yes, these are alternate solutions that we can do or things that can supplement
Yeah.
existing initiatives, but ultimately conserving what we have is paramount. And reforestation and everything comes in addition to the fact that we need to conserve. And I think that's a key message that particularly is relevant for Sri Lanka as well. So I would like to actually end off our conversation by asking you a question that is not directly related to your research, but more uh, about you as a person, a student, and your trajectory. I understand that you're also a big advocate for first-gen learners. I know that you're someone who's advocating for making education and particularly higher education something that is more equitable and accessible. There are a lot of people in Sri Lanka who are pursuing higher education in, fields like biology and fields like environmental science. Looking back at your personal journey, what are some key messages for any aspirational students, researchers who are watching this? Any key messages that you would like to leave them with?
Uh, First off, shameless self promo. I do some stuff on accessing higher education on social media. So at PhD with Katie, particularly with a focus on STEM, also science, tech, engineering, and maths. Yeah. But my main tip would be say yes and have some faith in yourself. I think it's so hard, especially nowadays in science and looking at higher education, to feel as though you're kind of suffocating and drowning, and there's so many different ways that you could go, or opportunities that you're not sure if you should take. I think one of the best ways to learn and to get experience and to therefore grow your kind of CV, if you will, is to just say yes. And look online, there are so many free courses and so many different advisory kind of courses and things that you can do to kind of develop your application to higher education. I think it's definitely getting better, and globally, education is becoming more accessible. But yeah, have faith in yourself and believe in yourself is the main way. If you don't have faith in yourself, how is someone reading your application going to know that you should be doing it? I think it comes from fundamentally believing in yourself that you can do it and you deserve to be in these really cool spaces. If someone would have told me even 3 years ago that I would be on a visa in Ecuador doing all this crazy stuff in Amazon, I would laugh and ask them if I could have some of what they were having, because I would think that they were just like dreaming. So yeah, I guess, yeah, believe in yourself is my main one. Sounds cringy, but it's true.
I mean, absolutely. Honestly, Katie, I know have taken more than enough of your time. Thank you so
No,
much
it's
for
fine.
tuning in. I know that you had to schedule these calls in the middle of, power cuts and particularly after coming back from a conference. So thank you so much. This is honestly just one of many conversations that we want to have in speaking to interesting people like Katie who are doing really cool work that will not only, I think, advance the academia and advance the research, but also I think the spill of benefits of conversations and also research like this will be felt across the world. So thank you so much again, once again, Katie, and stay tuned with us. Follow us on CSF, on Instagram, on Facebook, and on our website. See you. Bye.
Thanks for having me. Bye.